Chapter 5. First Dinner and Then Bed. As he, Gaggara and Quinagoff took to the air, Reyes could hear Mangloss, his sister, and the king still chatting with each other. Jenny had looked very tired. Somehow, he doubted she would want to stay and chat for too much longer. He listened to them for a moment or two. Then he was flying over one of the outer walls of the castle and started to devote all his attention to the road ahead. Normally, Reyes loved to fly, but in these last few days he had done more than enough flying, and was glad that it was only a relatively short flight back to the pillars. Although the pillars were wide enough for harpies to fly through, they would have to do so in single file. It was easier for him to land on this side of the two pillars and walk through. Besides, he had promised the king he would pass on a message to Anita before he returned to his village anyway. Despite the lateness of the hour, few of the soldiers guarding the pillars were yet asleep. A few reached for their weapons and kept them close at hand. Most kept an eye constantly fixed on the three harpies. The word of the king only went so far. Reyes walked slowly over to one of the nearest fires. He stretched out his hands towards the warmth, enjoying the heat it was producing. The soldiers gathered by that fire became more than a little restless. A few placed their hands on the hilts of their swords. Others grabbed for spears that were lying on the ground nearby. One made a grab for a bow and a quiver of arrows. Quinagoff, hovering close to Reyes, lowered her spear in a most threatening manner. Once again, Reyes had to grab hold of Quinagoff's spear and force her to hold it at a more neutral angle. Then he addressed the soldiers at the fire. "I need to see Anita. Could you tell me where she is?" Some of the soldiers seemed to physically relax. A couple even went so far as to release their grip on their weapons. Then one of them stood up. He didn't approach Reyes. Apparently he wasn't brave enough to get any closer to the harpy than he already was, but he did answer the question. The soldier pointed in the direction of a relatively large canvas tent that sat maybe 50 yards away. It was made of a dark canvas and would have been hard for Reyes to see if it hadn't been for the fire that was burning near it, or the two torches sitting in sconces on either side of the entry flap. If she isn't in that tent, she'll probably be warming herself by one of the nearby fires. "Thank you," Reyes said courteously. He turned to Quinagoff and Gaggara. "You two should head back to the village. This won't take long." "I'm coming with you," Quinagoff insisted. "It's my job to be at your side." Gaggara looked longingly at the pillars and then turned to follow her boyfriend. "I prefer to stay with you, handsome." Reyes sighed, and then he grinned. He was glad to have Gaggara with him. He didn't even mind Quinagoff's company. If only she would stop jumping at shadows. Anita was in the tent the soldier had pointed out. Although it was a fairly large tent, and although from the evidence it was clear that Anita slept in the tent, the large table that dominated the centre of the tent suggested that this was where Anita would call her meetings with her senior officers. She was alone in the tent at the moment, dressed in warm woolen clothing, her armour resting on a wooden mannequin in the corner of the tent. She sat on a wooden chest and was sipping what Reyes assumed to be a glass of wine. "Reyes," Anita said happily, jumping up from the chest. "It's good to see you again so soon." She looked him up and down. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" "The king sent me," Reyes told her. "The king?" Anita hesitated. "Oh, you mean Goatee?" "King Goatee, yes," Reyes told her. "He'd like to see you first thing in the morning. I think you might be getting a new job." Anita grinned. It'll be good to get away from these pillars. Then a thought seemed to occur to her. "Can I get you or either of your girls something to drink?" "I won't, thanks," Reyes told her. "I need to be getting back to my village before they send a war party to come and find me." Anita nodded. "Well, it was good to see you again. Don't be a stranger, will you?" Reyes bowed his head just slightly and turned to leave. "Oh," Anita said, "there is one thing you could do for me." Reyes glanced back at Anita expectantly. "As much as I enjoy seeing you naked, the next time you visit me, could you wear a skirt or something? That goes for your girls as well." Reyes laughed. "I'll see what I can do." The people of his village had been quite busy while Reyes had been with the king. He knew that harpies could be quite industrious when pressed, but he never imagined that they would be able to do so much as they had in such a short time. At most, they had had 2 hours between arriving at their new home and the sun setting behind the horizon, and in that time they had transformed the area. Already they had created quite a clearing, and while it wasn't yet large enough to house all the huts of the village, it was of a good size. Admittedly, no actual huts had been built yet, but there were a small number of temporary shelters that would at least keep the weather off of those who slept below them. There were also a good number of fires burning about the village. Harpies gathered about them in small groups trying to keep warm. Most would probably spend the coming night huddled together about those fires, sharing their body heat as well as the warmth of the fire. The fires weren't just a source of heat though. Most of them were being used to cook some of the small animals that the huntresses had caught in the area since their arrival. The smell of the meat seemed to penetrate the forest. Reyes couldn't smell them back when he'd been in the encampment. There, the smells of the local cooking fires had been strong enough to pervade his senses. Once Reyes was through the pillars though, the sense from the human cooking fires vanished, and all that was left to his senses were the meats being cooked by the huntresses of his village. Upon seeing Reyes return to the village, one of the harpies came over to greet him. She was fairly young, being at most no more than 10 years old. "Good to see you back, Chief," she commented. "Some of us were beginning to get worried." "At least you didn't form a war party," Reyes commented. "Some of us thought about it," the harpy replied. "You shouldn't have stayed away so long." "The human king and I had business to discuss," Reyes told her. "I got back when I could." "The human what?" the harpy asked. "Chief," Reyes replied. He had to remember that he had gotten into the habit of replacing certain words, such as king, with their Elistrian equivalent. These harpies had come with the invaders of the south, so if they spoke any elven language, it was most likely Cassitellan. "Anyway," the harpy said, "it's good to see you back. We don't have a hut ready for you yet, but if you'd like to follow me, some of the girls have prepared a shelter which would offer you a little bit of protection from the weather during the night." "Lead the way," Reyes commented, waving his arm. The harpy led the way to one of the nearby trees. It was a large tree with a thick trunk that was located inside the area of the clearing, but had yet to be felled. The tree was currently being used to support a weak-looking wooden shelter. It looked a little like a table big enough for one to lie under. A flat roof, created from tying many thin branches together, supported on the side by 8 legs that were paired, with each pair forming an X. Reyes doubted if it would keep the cold air out, but it should offer some minor protection should it start snowing again. "Thank you," Reyes hesitated. He didn't know this girl's name. "Gaggara," Quinnigoff told him. "Gaggara," Reyes said with a smile. "I'm sure this would be ideal for the night." Gaggara smiled happily. "I'm glad you are happy, my chief. I think before we settle in for the night, we could do with something to eat," Reyes said. He looked at Gaggara and Quinnigoff. "What do you think?" Gaggara nodded her head enthusiastically, while Quinnigoff showed no sign one way or the other. "Allow me," Gaggara insisted. "I'll fetch something back for all of you. Can I get you something to drink? There's a river not too far from here, and some of the girls have been to it to fetch some water." "I could use something to drink," Reyes agreed. Gaggara turned, and a second later was in the air flying towards one of the nearby cooking fires. Reyes walked over to the shelter and examined it a little more closely. It looked comfortable enough. Whoever had built the shelter had placed a bed of fresh leaves underneath. That should help cushion his body while he slept. It was just a little on the narrow side, though. This had clearly been built with just Reyes in mind. No allowance seemed to be made for Gaggara. "Gaggara?" Reyes called. "Yes, handsome," Gaggara replied, walking over to where he stood. "Do you think we can both fit in this small space?" Reyes asked. Back in the Hope barracks, they had often shared a bed that was only intended for one, but there had never been room for either of his wings or his tail, and Gaggara hadn't been pregnant back then. "I'm willing to try," Gaggara cooed. She put an arm around him and rested her head on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" Reyes asked worriedly. "You sound a little subdued, and you've been very quiet this evening." "I have been feeling a little off colour today," Gaggara admitted. "I think it's a combination of carrying and having to fly such a long distance. I'm sure a good night's sleep would do me the world of good." "If you're sure, my love," Reyes said with concern. "I'm sure," Gaggara assured him. "A bite to eat and some rest, and I'll be fine." Reyes smiled. Then another thought occurred to him. What happened to your 2 bodyguards? She had had them that morning before they left the village's last location. Reyes could even remember Gaggara talking to them just before the village took wing. Since they had landed, though, there hadn't been a single sign of either of them. "I told them I no longer needed their services," Gaggara explained. "I told them they could return to their duties as huntresses." "Oh," Reyes said uncertainly. Gaggara explained. "In a village it's normal for a male to be protected. She has 4 bodyguards who take it in shifts to protect her. This you know. It's unusual for the leader of the village to have the same privilege. By having bodyguards, Groma had effectively made herself a kind of surrogate chief. I didn't think it was right that the talents of some of our best huntresses should be wasted in such a way." "I'll bet they weren't happy," Quinnigoff piped up. "There is a lot of face to be had by being given the task of bodyguard, even to the leader." "That didn't occur to me," Gaggara replied. I hope they understood my motives. What about you? Reyes asked of Quinagoff. Shouldn't you be relieved by now? I'm sure the others will be here as soon as word reaches them that we have returned, Quinagoff said, assuming those who guard you while you sleep have ever existed, my chief. I what? Reyes asked, slightly confused. Gaggara explained. She means assuming that your night guards didn't desert the village on our flight here. If they did, well, maybe we can promote Maya too. Right, Reyes commented. He nodded his head. Only the merest of minutes had passed since Gaggara had left to fetch some food for the three of them. She returned now, landing at a short yet respectful distance from where Reyes was standing. Her arms were full. My chief, Gaggara said, the girl in charge of the cooking fires placed some of the choicest cuts of meat to one side for you and for our beloved leader. I like being the leader, Gaggara said with a grin. Gaggara was looking a little way down with all the meat she was carrying, not to mention the 3 vessels containing water that she was trying to grip between her elbows. Somehow she had flown here carrying all this stuff and hadn't dropped a thing. There were 3 fairly large chunks of meat in her hands. The largest of these looked as if it was the haunch of a deer. Gaggara then approached Reyes slowly. As the chief, it seemed that the choice of which meat to take should fall first to him. Reyes could sense Quinagoff hovering close nearby as Gaggara approached. The bodyguard watched her every step, as if she somehow doubted her sister's true motives. Gaggara came to a stop in front of Reyes, her hands so full that she was unable to offer him any of what she had. Reyes was going to have to help himself. For the briefest of moments, Reyes considered taking the haunch for himself, but after a quick glance at his girlfriend, he remembered that she was pregnant. Since she was eating for 2, it made sense for him to leave the largest chunk of meat for her. He made his mind up. Reyes reached for the second largest chunk of meat. Please, my chief, Gaggara commented, stopping him. That piece is not for you. It is not right that you should have a smaller piece of meat than anyone else. The haunch is for you. Reyes hesitated. He hovered his hand over the chunk of meat he had been reaching for, and then glanced around at his girlfriend. It's okay, Gaggara said. I'm not really all that hungry. If you're sure, Reyes said uncertainly. I'm sure, Gaggara replied. Gaggara is right. You are the male. You should have the largest chunk. As leader, I'll take the next largest. And I'll take the smallest, my chief, Quinagoff added. I can always get more once the others arrive to replace me. Reyes nodded. He took the deer haunch from one of the 3 vessels from Gaggara's grip, making the harpy relax a little from the pressure. Gaggara then walked over to where Gaggara was standing, and she was now able to hand the chunk of meat that Reyes had first reached for to her village's leader. She also handed a second vessel of water to Gaggara. Gaggara's third and final stop was with Quinagoff. By now she could carry the remaining meat in just her hand, with the last vessel of water in the other. It took mere moments to give them to the bodyguard. Once she was done, Gaggara took to the air and took a perch in one of the nearby trees. She stayed there for maybe a minute as she watched the 3 tucking into the food she had brought them, and then she was off again, flying towards one of the cooking fires, no doubt with an eye to keep him warm. For a moment, Reyes considered offering to swap what he had left of the haunch with Gaggara, but he couldn't help but feel that Gaggara might be in some way insulted by the gesture. Besides, Reyes thought to himself, justifying his actions in not offering to swap further, Gaggara had already said that she wasn't all that hungry. Also, Gaggara seemed to be struggling with what she did have. She ate maybe a third to a half of it, and then let the remainder drop to the ground. Reyes, on the other hand, was very hungry. He was hungrier than he thought he was. He devoured the deer's haunch, throwing the remains over his shoulder and into the deep forest beyond the clearing when he had finished. Once his meal was finished, Reyes eyed the rest of what Gaggara had been eating, but resisted taking it. Had Gaggara wanted him to have it, she would have offered it to him. Maybe it was just an oversight that she hadn't. But until she did, that was Gaggara's meat, and for all he knew, she was saving the rest of it for later. It was getting late, and now that he had eaten, Reyes felt it was time to turn in for the night. All over the village, other harpies were having much the same idea. Many had only stayed up as long as they had because they were waiting for their mail to return, and as soon as he had come back from the encampment, they had started to bed down for the night. Not everyone would sleep the night away. There would always be a few that would take perches in the tops of the trees and keep an eye, or, more importantly, an ear, on the surrounding countryside, ready to alert the entire village at the first sign of trouble. Reyes had to get down onto his knees and crawl into the shelter provided. He scooted over as far as he could to make room for Gaggara, disturbing the pile of leaves a little as he did so. Then he called hopefully to his girlfriend. "Going to join me, sweetheart?" I think they have another shelter for the leader, my chief, Quinnigoff commented. I think I'd rather she sleep here with me, Reyes said. As you desire, my chief, Quinnigoff said without inflection. Quinnigoff? Reyes asked. Yes, my chief, Quinnigoff asked. It's cold, Reyes told her. What happened to the animal skins that were in the old chief's hut? Well, they belong to the old chief, my chief, Quinnigoff said. It was assumed you wouldn't want anything she left behind. We left them with the rest of the village. We'll fetch you some more over time if you wish. I can go and see about getting you the deer skin, assuming it wasn't destroyed when they butchered the animal. Thank you, Reyes told her. Maybe in the meantime you could light me a fire somewhere nearby. Not too close. Don't want to set the shelter alight. I'll get right on it, my chief, Quinnigoff agreed. As Quinnigoff set to work on building a fire a short distance from the shelter, Gaggara joined Reyes underneath. It was a tight squeeze. The shelter really only had been built for one of them. The two of them lay on their sides, their wings and tails poking out from under the shelter. They stared lovingly at each other for a few minutes. Gaggara was clearly very tired. It had been a long day, and slowly it became obvious that she was having trouble keeping her eyes open. Reyes kissed her gently on the side of her head, then just lay back and watched her in the light of the campfires. Eventually he too could no longer keep his eyes open, and was drifting off to sleep.